provides for us. So let's see here. So I've titled this presentation Politics, Process, and Policy, because we're all familiar with what the political situation is now and the strong partisanship that exists. Because of that, and I will explain this in just a moment, it dictates that a certain process has to be used in order to move legislation. But because of limitations on that process, it indicates and it leads to what can and cannot be done as a matter of public policy. And it's not the way we all learned how a bill becomes law in 11th grade. It's very, very different, and it has very, very significant implications. So back in the early days, shall we say, maybe more than, I'll say about a dozen years ago, the only time that any piece of consequential legislation could pass is if it was done on a bipartisan basis and if it had the support of moderates, that is to say, sort of the liberal to moderate Republicans, the moderate to conservative Democrats. There were enough of them in Congress that they really held the key to power, and their price, if you will, for agreeing to support some legislation was that it had to be done on a bipartisan basis, and from a policy perspective, it had to meet somewhere in the middle. For a variety of reasons that we could spend all morning on, those moderates have sort of all but vanished. But it isn't entirely sort of the fault, I think, of the elected officials that is the case. The voters themselves, of course, have changed. And I think, to me, the most astounding statistic that underscores this point is something that I learned about a year ago, and that is in the 40-year period between 1960 and the year 2000, on average, half of the US senators represented a state where the presidential candidate of the other party had won in that particular state. So, Claire McCaskill, let's say Democrat in Missouri, but the Republican, Bush had won the time before. So half of the US senators. Today, six. Whereas previously voters were willing to sort of split their votes and identify the person that they thought was the best candidate, regardless of party, people are much more voting along straight party lines. And then, of course, there are plenty of intra-party conflicts as well, notably that the group of moderates that still exists in Congress these days, particularly, well, I shouldn't say particularly in the House, but in the House and the Senate, are frankly somewhat intimidated by their colleagues from the more extreme wings of their parties, who tell them that, unlike in the past where it was always understood that you would support whoever the incumbent was, if they don't sort of toe the line, they're going to run somebody against them in the primary. So the voice of the moderates has been pretty much extinguished. Therefore, now, the exact opposite. Any kind of consequential legislation appears to only be able to pass if one party controls the White House as well as both houses of Congress. The last time the Republicans had that was the first 2 years of the prior administration. The last time the Democrats had that before right now were the first 2 years of the Obama administration. And what happened? The first midterm election afterward, the House flipped and the president's party lost control. And I think that point is certainly not lost on President Biden and the congressional Democratic leadership, who realize that in all likelihood, that is going to happen again this fall, and therefore they have a very short window of time to move forward on their agenda. So that's the politics, and now we segue into the process. Because of that problem, oh, okay, no problem. So because of that issue, both parties have resorted to the so-called budget reconciliation process in order to move really consequential legislation. The reason being that normally in the Senate you need, as you know, a 60-vote majority in order to overcome a filibuster, a delay tactic. But a budget bill cannot be filibustered, and therefore it only requires a simple majority in order to pass. And neither party has had a 60-vote margin in the Senate for many, many years. However, and this is sort of where process then dictates policy, there are limits to what you can do on a budget bill, specifically pursuant to something called the Byrd Rule, named after the late Senator Robert Byrd, who crafted the rule. And essentially what it says is that for a provision to be part of a budget bill, it has to have a significant budgetary impact for the federal government. It can raise money, it can lose money, but it can't be insignificant, and it can't be sort of incidental to what the real policy objective is of the provision. So therefore, big portions of the Affordable Care Act, as you may recall, were passed using this budget reconciliation process. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act in 2017 used it. The American Rescue Plan, which passed in the first few weeks of the Biden administration, they used a budget reconciliation process. And the Build Back Better Act, which was sort of dominated the political and legislative scene last year in Congress, it also was part of a budget reconciliation measure. The issue, of course, here is that partisan enacted policies are not sustainable. As soon as the political winds change in Washington, the other party comes in. They didn't have any ownership of what was enacted previously, so they seek to undo it. There are two other byproducts, I would say, of this gridlock, and that is more activity at the regulatory level, because of course that's how the executive branch is able to put its stamp on public policy without regard, in most instances, to what Congress has to say about it. And of course, more activity at the state level. And we in the employee benefits world have certainly seen a myriad of activity going on there as well. I do want to say one thing about the Byrd Rule, by the way. If somebody raises an objection in the Senate that a provision in this budget bill would violate the Byrd Rule because it doesn't have a significant federal revenue impact, it goes through a process that is affectionately called a bird bath, where the Senate parliamentarian looks to see whether or not it meets the standards of the rule. And if something is then stripped out of the bill, it's referred to as bird droppings. You can't make this stuff up, but there you go. So I want to talk a little bit for 3 slides here about the sort of health politics as well. This was a poll that was conducted by Morning Consult. It's just one poll, but I think it's somewhat illustrative. And the results of this one, I think, are generally very positive for those of us who are involved in the world of employer-sponsored healthcare. And that is that there was a lot of that 3/4 of individuals basically feel positively about their employer-sponsored health care. That's the blue, the dark blue and the light blue. What's really interesting here is that you don't see much differential. If you look at the three rows on the bottom, you don't really see much difference between and among people who are registered Republicans, Democrats, or independents. Now, hard to know how you want to interpret this one. Is it a glass virtually half empty or virtually half full? But there was a lot of conversation, of course, in the presidential election, principally pushed by Senator Bernie Sanders, about essentially moving away from an employer-sponsored healthcare system to a Medicare for all approach. According to this poll, 42% of people said that they would be likely to switch if they had the opportunity to go into a government program, which of course wouldn't even be a complete sort of repeal of the employer-sponsored system, which I don't think is anywhere in the future, but would enable everybody to choose to go into a larger government program if they wanted to. The last slide, not surprisingly, people don't feel quite as enthusiastic about the idea of exiting their employer-sponsored plan in order to go into the individual market, presumably because they wouldn't have the kind of financial support and premium subsidy that employer-sponsored plans include. Oops, one too many. So I want to move next to talk a little bit about one issue that has certainly dominated a lot of the conversation legislatively around healthcare in Congress the last year. And that is, of course, we all recognize the extraordinary growth of the use of telehealth, principally as a result, of course, of the pandemic. You also know that, of course, that the CARES Act would have allowed HSA-eligible high-deductible health plans to cover telehealth services without imposing a cost sharing. Well, when Congress passed the CARES Act, of course, they expected that by the end of 2021, the public health emergency would be long over and therefore that provision could expire. No such luck, of course. So it did expire. However, the Consolidated Appropriations Act that then was passed in March, did renew the provision, but only for the period starting April 1 through the end of this year. So how you'll deal with sort of expenses incurred in the first 3 months is still to be determined. There is, however, bipartisan legislation called the Telehealth Expansion Act that would make that provision permanent. And so this is one where a lot of different stakeholder groups, employers, health plans, consumer groups, others are sort of bound together in trying to see if this kind of provision could be made to be a permanent feature of the law. I want to do a little bit of a deeper dive around the Build Back Better Act, even though it is currently stalled in the Senate. It passed the House of Representatives, but largely as a result of two senators who would not agree to support it, it is stalled. However, I do think that President Biden and the Democratic leadership of Congress are going to try to pull out certain pieces of it and see if they can get those things through this year, heading into the November elections. One of the most significant provisions of the Build Back Better Act concerns prescription drugs, not only because it would be significant for prescription drug policy itself, but also because the money that was estimated to be saved by the Medicare program would be used in order to pay for a variety of other provisions of this very expansive Build Back Better Act. And specifically, what it said was that the Medicare program, Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, would negotiate for a certain number of drugs with the drug manufacturers in terms of the price that the Medicare program would be willing to pay for these drugs. Now, if the manufacturers didn't agree to what the government said that they were going to pay, they would be hit with a 95% excise tax. So one might question whether or not that's a true arm's length negotiation, but so be it. And that, of course, would result in an enormous savings to the federal government. Importantly, that ability to avail oneself of that federal government negotiated rate would not be extended to the commercial market, to individual or to group purchasers. Why? Even though the policymakers really wanted it to, because of the Byrd rule. They can't really make the case that allowing private payers to avail themselves of these lower costs would have a substantial impact on federal revenue. So in a very significant way, they were curtailed in what they could do. And instead of therefore it being a provision that arguably could lead to lower drug care costs for private purchasers, instead, should this become law, there's a substantial risk that it will increase prices for private purchasers as the drug manufacturers understandably look elsewhere to make up for the lost revenue that they're not going to be making by selling the drugs to the federal government. There's another provision in there as well that essentially says that for a certain number of drugs that would be identified, the manufacturers would have to provide a rebate to the Medicare program if the cost of those drugs would exceed the rate of inflation. And here again, there would be no rebate to private purchasers if the cost of those drugs went up. However, the increase in the cost of drugs that private payers pay would be included in the calculation for determining whether or not the cost of that drug exceeded the inflation rate. And so presumably that provision, should it become law, would have some mitigating impact on the cost of drugs for everyone. Just a few weeks ago, the House of Representatives passed the Affordable Insulin Now Act, which essentially caps at $35 per month the amount that any individual could be required to pay as their copay for insulin. And so should that become law, should the Senate take that up and pass that, and certainly President Biden would sign that if they do, what implication might that have for other costs to be borne by employer sponsors of healthcare coverage? Keeps jumping here a little bit. A couple of other provisions of the Build Back Better Act that I think are worth noting, because again, even if the Build Back Better Act itself doesn't have any life, these are ideas that are going to be brought up again. As we know, they sort of criteria for whether or not somebody is offered affordable minimum essential healthcare coverage is whether or not the employee is required to pay more than 9.5% indexed of their household income in order for as their portion of the premium contribution. This provision would lower that to 8.5%, so they would not be required to pay as much, and the threshold would not be indexed until 2027. The provision would also allow individuals with income below 138% of the poverty level, if they live in those 10 states that have not expanded the Medicaid program as the Affordable Care Act permits, to go into the individual marketplace and get a premium tax credit for purchase of coverage. However, doing so would not then trigger an employer mandate penalty if those individuals, in fact, went and did so. Obviously, a lot of interest and attention around the question of healthcare costs. There is legislation that's been introduced, which is not particularly on a fast track, but it's worth noting because it does represent one other area where there is some bipartisan agreement, and that is the Healthy Competition for Better Care Act. And essentially what this legislation would do is to pick up some of the provisions of the No Surprises Act that didn't make it over the finish line and get included when the No Surprises Act was passed. It would essentially prohibit anti-competitive contracting terms that would be imposed by healthcare providers that stifle competition. For example, contract provisions that say, if you want to include, hospital A in your network, you must include all the hospitals of this hospital system in your network as well. So those kinds of things would no longer be permitted. I'm going to say more about mental health parity in just a moment, but I wanted to speak sort of more broadly about the issue of mental health in the following way, that this is one area where, again, I think there's been a great deal, obviously, of concern about access to mental health providers even pre-pandemic. And of course, that problem was enormously exacerbated by the pandemic itself. There really is, I think, a genuine interest on the part of Republicans and Democrats to work together to find some solutions to this problem of access. So far, they're still sort of in an information gathering mode and no real indications of any particular policy ideas for advancing that cause, but they're at least on the right track, I think, in terms of what they want to do. I also want to make mention of something that was established just a couple of months ago, and that is in the House of Representatives, the Republican caucus established something called the Healthy Future Task Force. I think you're probably aware that, since the passage of the Affordable Care Act in 2010 until about 2017, there were literally dozens of occasions where there was a vote either in the House or the Senate, pushed by the Republicans, of course, to try to repeal the Affordable Care Act. At no point during that process did they actually offer up what would be the alternative to vote on if, in fact, they succeeded in repealing the law. But this Healthy Futures Task Force sort of is a change in that respect. They're trying to put together their idea of what the healthcare system should really look like. It remains unclear at this point whether or not this is something that they will reveal later this year and seek to campaign on the issue and sort of draw a contrast between their vision and the Democrats' vision, or whether or not they're going to wait and see whether or not they in fact do claim the majority in the House of Representatives next year and then unveil whatever their ideas are, assuming that they can agree among themselves what the composition of that kind of a policy ought to be. In terms of COVID response, I think that there's fatigue in Congress, just like there is in so many other parts of our society. A lot of this, I guess, will depend on when ever the public health emergency actually ends. But I think that there's a diminishing interest on the part of most members of Congress to do much more funding if the pandemic remains sort of at the level that we are experiencing currently. There is some effort, at least starting in the Senate, to try to deal with, okay, how can we be better prepared for the next pandemic? And so by a rather substantial bipartisan vote, the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee passed something called the Prevent Pandemics Act. And you can see sort of the items on the screen there in terms of what are the principal components of this legislation. As you can see, there's really nothing there that specifically directly relates to employee benefit plans, but something certainly for us to be thinking about and to sort of weighing in should something like this actually get some legs. Under the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2021 that passed at the very, very beginning of 2021, I think, as you know, plans must prepare and be prepared to give to the Department of Labor what's called a non-quantitative treatment report to sort of show what you're doing with respect to mental health benefits versus physical health benefits, and give that information to the Department of Labor when they ask for it. The Department of Labor reported a few months ago that they had asked 160 different sponsors to give them these reports, and not one of those reports was deemed to be adequate by the Department of Labor. My colleague Jason sort of pointed out a parallel for me that I think sort of works here. If you have a teacher who administers a test and some of the students get A's and B's and C's and maybe 5% of them fail, maybe there's a problem with those students. Either they don't grasp the information or maybe they didn't do their homework. If 100% of the students fail, there's a problem with the teacher. And I think that this is an instance where employers are trying their very, very best to comply with this provision, but they have no guidance from the Department of Labor in terms of what is expected in order to have an adequate report that will pass muster with the department. So we and others have really been insisting to the Department of Labor that they must provide guidance so that employers and health plans can do their duty and provide this information that is required by law. The Department of Labor has said that it will publish some guidance around this later this summer, so we'll wait and see on that. In the meantime, however, in the Build Back Better Act, and now in the President's proposed budget for the fiscal year that will begin in October, there is a provision that would actually authorize the Department of Labor to impose civil monetary penalties on health plans and employer plan sponsors for violations of the Mental Health Parity Act. You may have seen, I talked earlier about the, that 9.5% affordability standard being proposed to be reduced to 8.5%. And I'm sure you're all familiar with something called the so-called family glitch, which has really been a problem in the ACA since the very early days. And that is that this 9.5% standard, you can't be expected to pay more than 9.5% of your household income as a contribution toward premium, is based upon employee-only coverage. So therefore, it makes it pretty difficult as a practical matter for those who want to have family coverage. The Biden administration just moved forward on proposed regulations that would fix this problem by saying that if the cost of family coverage is more than 9.5% to the family, then those family members would be able to go into the insurance marketplace and be eligible again for a premium tax credit subsidy. It would not trigger, however, an employer mandate penalty tax if they did so. And what's interesting about it is I think it's a very good policy and one that many of us have been sort of advocating for a long time, but it does create another sort of ironic glitch. And that is you could theoretically have a situation where an employee isn't eligible to go into the marketplace and get a subsidy because the employee, for employee-only coverage, wouldn't have exceeded the threshold, but the family members could go into the marketplace and be eligible for it as well. So things to work out, I guess you might say. There is an executive order that the president put out directing the different agencies and departments to look for other ways to expand coverage and improve quality, but did not really provide any specifics to the agencies in terms of what they should be doing along those lines. If you could. Thank you so much. And surprise billing. I'm not going to say much about this because you have a very excellent presentation by Ryan Work from the Self-Insurance Institute a little bit later this morning on it, but I'll just mention a couple of, oops, what happened here? But I just want to mention one point, and that is, as you know, there are regulations that have been put forward to implement the provisions of the No Surprises Act. By and large, I think those provisions were very much in line with what employers and health plans want in terms of the criteria that the independent dispute resolution entity would have to use in determining what the appropriate amount is to reimburse an out-of-network provider. That caused a number of provider groups to bring lawsuits in several different states challenging those rules. And a court in Texas actually has ruled initially in favor of the plaintiffs in that lawsuit. And so the status of these rules is somewhat in doubt. A number of other cases have been filed, including one in New York that's challenging the whole package of regulations on constitutional grounds. And it's hard to imagine that with this litigation occurring out there, that it's not going to have some sort of impact on what it is that the regulatory agencies decide to do in terms of finalizing these rules. And so the rules were supposed to be finalized next month. The agencies have now put that off until later this summer. And if the litigation continues, I think, to sort of go against the government here and in favor of the healthcare providers who are suing, I think that is certainly going to have some effect on the government regulatory agencies sort of pulling back on the extent to which they're going to require that the independent dispute resolution entity has to use the median in-network rate as the starting point for determining what the appropriate amount is to reimburse these out-of-network providers. And just a potpourri of other regulatory issues that I think are worth mentioning, because as I indicated before, one of the byproducts of congressional gridlock is more activity at the regulatory level, and we certainly see that. There are rules that have never been promulgated pursuant to the Affordable Care Act, but finally now will be, essentially saying that health plans cannot discriminate against a certain category of providers, let's say like chiropractors, as long as those that category of providers are licensed to do certain procedures or treatments in that particular state. You could still not include them in the network for sort of other reasons, but you can't just do it based upon the fact that they are a certain type of provider if they're licensed to do that. There also will be some guidance coming forward to implement the provisions of the Consolidated Appropriations Act that would prohibit certain gag clauses from being included in health plans. One of the things that has been on the to-do list for the agencies for years and years and years has been to move forward with some guidance on how VEBAs would be able to be permitted to use surplus assets to transfer those for other welfare plan purposes. So we should expect to see some activity there. There will also be some guidance on some reporting to the different departments, the so-called tri-agencies, Health and Human Services, Treasury, and Labor, on drug expenditures, where plans will have to just provide information to the government, and then the government will be able to sort of use this information and not to identify specific, instances and what particular companies or whatever are paying, but sort of in the aggregate to be able to understand more about trends in drug costs, rebate activity, and so forth. And then a lot of concern, of course, for quite some time around consolidation in the health provider industry. And so the Federal Trade Commission is getting into the act on that and has put out a request for comment around those issues. Whether or not that leads to any rulemaking ultimately by the FTC remains to be seen, but they are in the early stages of doing that. I want to turn now to talk just for a few moments about paid leave, because this issue is another one, of course, that has been very pressing for many, many, many families for many, many, many years. But again, the pandemic sort of shined a very bright spotlight on the challenges around paid leave. So again, included in the Build Back Better Act, which was passed by the House of Representatives, is a provision that would establish a brand new federal program to provide paid leave, 4 weeks of paid leave. It would essentially replace, roughly speaking, 2/3 of wages. The criteria for who would be eligible for the paid leave and the circumstances that would trigger the eligibility of paid leave is actually broader than what is provided in the Family and Medical Leave Act for unpaid leave. And the reason for this is, again, an example of the impact of the Byrd Rule, of the process. They can't say that making these changes to the Family and Medical Leave Act in order to conform the criteria for unpaid leave to the criteria for paid leave has an impact on federal revenue. And so they're not able to make those two provisions consistent. And so you have this ironic situation, should this become law, that actually it will be easier and there'll be more circumstances where you'll be eligible for paid leave than you would for unpaid leave. Clearly not the ideal of what the public policymakers would like to do, but they are sort of restricted in their ability to actually pass legislation that is consistent in that fashion. This provision would not be a mandate on employers to provide paid leave. Every individual would be eligible for paid leave. So if their employer didn't provide it, they would be able to go into this federal program. But the legislation also provides that employers who provide a certain standard of paid leave that matches the criteria in the federal program, they would actually be eligible for a grant that would essentially reimburse them for 90% of the cost. One of the critical issues, though, for employers is that the legislation does not in any way preempt the laws in the 10 states that have already enacted mandatory paid leave legislation. And it doesn't do anything to actually preclude, and those are called the legacy states. It also doesn't include any provisions that would prevent so-called non-legacy states from adding on to whatever this new federal provision would be. And I think that one of the things that we've sort of all discovered over the course of the last 2 years is that the idea of being a multi-state employer is no longer within the realm of big mega companies, but there are a lot of small and mid-sized companies that now all of a sudden have employees who have moved to a different state. And therefore, they have now become multi-state employers who would be very concerned about a patchwork quilt of different paid leave laws. You've got the federal law, and then you would have still on the books these different state laws. And I have to tell you that unfortunately, neither Republicans nor Democrats in Congress have been terribly sympathetic to the concerns expressed by employers about this problem. And it's really one of the issues that we hear about from our members almost more than just about anything else in terms of managing these sort of plethora of different inconsistent state and in some instances local laws. And so I'll just sort of want to share with you this particular poll, which we found was pretty interesting. We commissioned this one to be done, and there were sort of two questions here. The first, and I'll read them because it's kind of hard perhaps to make it out on the screen. Would you rather have your paid leave benefits administered by your employer alone or by a combination of your employer and your state government or the federal government? And as you can see, by a 2-to-1 margin, the respondents to this particular national poll conducted by a national polling firm which was actually President Biden's campaign polling firm, said they would rather have it administered by the employer rather than having to go to the federal government program for 4 weeks and then come back to the employer and get an additional 3 weeks or whatever it might be. And then we also asked the question, which view regarding paid leave comes closest to your own view? And I'll read it. Number one, employees working the same job for the same company should receive the same amount of paid leave, regardless of the state in which they work. That was one view. The second view is employees working the same job for the same company should receive the amount of leave determined by their particular state government. And so as you can see, by a more than 2-to-1 margin, people believe that would be most equitable if you're working for the same employer, doing the same job, that you should get the same amount of leave, regardless of where you work. This sentiment, and again, it's just one poll, albeit from the president's own polling firm, certainly is a point that has not yet been fully absorbed and understood or agreed to by members of Congress, in large part because they don't want to step on the toes of the states that have already enacted paid leave laws. I want to turn next to retirement and then wrap up with 2 slides on some tax issues. And one last poll to share with you. There's a polling firm called Public Opinion Strategies that has done an election night poll on a variety of different issues going back to the mid-1990s. And so in 2018 and again in 2020, we gave them some questions to include in their poll related to employee benefits. And I wanted to share with you the one related to the question of employers and trust. And the question was, which one of the following sources do you trust the most to help you achieve a secure retirement? The green is plans provided by employers through a pension or 401k. Red is financial products purchased by you individually, and the blue and the gold are plans provided by the federal government or state government. And so as you can see, by a rather healthy margin, employers are the most trusted source for retirement security. And that number even grew by 5% in the 2020 election. So we're going to continue to do this polling along with a number of other questions relating to health benefits and paid leave and other things each election night. It's a poll of voters who either voted on election day or voted prior to election day. And it's interesting, I think, to kind of follow what some of these trends are. Retirement policy, unlike much of healthcare policy, which has been plagued with partisanship for many, many years, retirement policy has enjoyed a good deal of bipartisan support. And that is indicated by the passage by a whopping 414-to-5 vote in the House of Representatives to pass the Securing a Strong Retirement Act. Right now, that issue is under consideration in the House of Representatives. There are 2 committees that are working on that. One committee has sort of jurisdiction over the labor law provisions that have to be, the ERISA provisions that have to be changed. The other one has jurisdiction over the tax provisions. And I think there's, again, a genuine bipartisan interest in moving something forward. Whether or not, in the absence of a budget reconciliation bill, they'll actually have a legislative vehicle to move something like this and then kind of get agreement with the House of Representatives over what it passed, I think remains to be seen. But I think that this enormous, almost unanimous vote in the House of Representatives has certainly added some momentum to the Senate to also act here. What are some of the key provisions of the House passed bill, most of which are also being considered in the Senate? I'm not going to go through all of them. I think you all are going to get copies of these slides, so you'll see that yourself, but you'll see that it includes many provisions that I'm sure you all have been looking at, that you've been hearing about from plan participants and others. And so I think there's a real opportunity to make some progress here. I would point out just sort of the 2 at the bottom. One would be to increase to age 75 the sort of required starting date for minimum required distributions. The agencies haven't yet even completed their work on implementing the provisions of the Secure Act that would raise the age to 72. I'll talk about that in just a second. But this legislation already is sort of going to push that up a little bit higher. It also would provide for greater catch-up contributions for workers in that the 3-year band of being aged 62 to 64. Essentially, that those individuals, if they have the financial wherewithal to do so, would be able to put $10,000 into their 401k plan or other type of defined contribution plan. There are a couple of provisions that I would say are key provisions that are still in somewhat dispute. The effort on the part of the House and many in the Senate is to sort of facilitate more e-delivery with a sort of a once a year annual paper benefit statement, unless people specifically opted out of getting that annual statement. But participant groups and others are actually trying to pull back on the trend toward more e-delivery and to require more notices to be still provided through conventional means, through sort of paper notices being mailed. And then the whole issue of missing participants. I know that we've heard from so many of our members that have been subjected to Department of Labor audits that very often the biggest issue in these DOL audits is the question of what are you as an employer doing with respect to trying to track down missing participants. And this has been a provision that has held up the completion of audits for years. Again, as with the case with mental health parity, without any guidance really from the Department of Labor in terms of the specific steps that employers have to take in order to be deemed to have done enough to try to find these missing participants. So there was a provision in the House passed bipartisan measure initially that would have essentially said that small accounts that are held by employers would be sent to the PBGC, Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation, and individuals would have to sort of go to the PBGC to try to obtain. What's happening here? Hang on one second. And would have to try to obtain the money for them. I swear to God, I'm not touching it. I swear to God. See? All right. Here, I'm going to do this. So they changed that. But what the legislation does do is creates a searchable database for individuals to see if they can find any of their account balances for themselves or if they're a beneficiary of somebody who's passed away. Where this stands right now is that participant groups are sort of seeking the Department of Labor to write a very specific definition of who is considered to be a missing participant. Employer groups are looking for a safe harbor that will say that as long as you follow the enumerated steps, that in fact you are meeting the terms and doing everything within your power to try to find and deliver money to those participants. Very quickly, I want to just mention that there are revenue raising provisions in this bipartisan legislation. All those catch-up contributions that I mentioned, all catch-up contributions would have to be required to be provided in a Roth form. Matching contributions would be permitted to be provided in a Roth form. The hardship withdrawals for 403B plans would be aligned with the rules that apply to 401k plans. Here, just sort of a sampling of some of the topics that are also included either in the legislation that's under consideration by the 2 Senate committees or in other individual bills that have been introduced. So as you can see, it's a pretty wide range of different issues. I want to just wrap up by talking about money. Because if you ever wonder why it is that Congress is so focused on making changes on health policy and on retirement policy, specifically changes that would raise money for the federal government, the answer to that question lies in this chart, which shows us tax expenditures. A tax expenditure is any provision of the Internal Revenue Code that accounts for lost revenue to the federal government. And as you can see from this chart, the two largest tax expenditures by far are those that are attributed to the tax favor treatment of employer-sponsored health coverage over this 10-year period of time from 2022 through 2031. It is estimated to be over $3 trillion of lost revenue and $2.1 trillion of lost revenue as a result of the tax favor treatment of employer-sponsored retirement plans, both defined contribution and defined benefit. So it dwarfs all of these other tax expenditures, the amount that you get to deduct for your home mortgage interest or your charitable contributions. That's where the money is. Now, the assumptions that underlie these very large numbers are, I think, somewhat questioned by many of us. For example, they say that every dollar that you spend on health coverage for your employees is a dollar that you otherwise would pay out in the form of taxable wages. So the $3 trillion of lost revenue is individual income tax that the federal government is not collecting because we all enjoy our employer-sponsored coverage on a tax-favored basis. Also, they don't quite fully take into account that in the world of retirement, it's somewhat different because it's not like it's foregone forever. It's merely recaptured later on when the person retires and they receive the benefits out of the plan. Nonetheless, I don't think anybody would dispute the fact that there's a loss of federal revenue by virtue of the fact that these benefits are provided on a tax-favored basis. So we decided to say, okay, let's assume we're wrong and the federal government is right. And this really is the amount of money that the federal government is losing as a result of the tax-favored treatment of benefits. So what are we as a nation getting for this enormous investment? And interestingly enough, what we found was that for health benefits, although the tax loss to the federal government 2019 was $152 billion, employers were spending close to $814 billion on healthcare coverage for their employees and their family members. As you can see, the ratio is even more significant on the retirement side. So for every dollar of revenue loss for healthcare, $5.34 is being paid out in the form of benefits, $7.18 on the retirement side. This is an enormous bargain for the federal government, for all of us as taxpayers. It would cost us so much more to provide the same level of financial security for health and retirement needs if it had to be done exclusively through a direct employer payment to individuals. So I think this is something for us to sort of keep in mind as we visit with our lawmakers, as we educate them about these issues, as they look for ways to raise revenue, because it's important that they understand not just what is being spent, but I think also what is being saved. So with that, I think that concludes my time, and I'll look to Daniel to see whether or not there is time for a question or not. There's 1 minute left. No, he's giving me this sign. Okay, thanks so much for including me. It's a great program, and I'm really honored to be here. Thank you.